I woke to the scent of dark wine on warm leather and something I could never undo. The sheets beneath me were heavier than any blanket I had ever owned, thick black velvet that still held the faint heat of another body. My skin felt the cool morning air where the fabric had slipped away during the night. I lay there for a long moment, eyes closed, letting the room settle around me before I dared open them. My head throbbed in slow, heavy pulses, each one reminding me that last night had been real. I sat up gradually, the motion careful as though moving too fast might shatter whatever fragile balance remained. The blanket pooled around my waist. I was completely naked. My fingers brushed the edge of the mattress, smooth, expensive, nothing like the thin, straw-filled pallet back in our rented room by the lower docks. My clothes lay scattered across the polished stone floor like evidence left behind after a crime. My white shirt crumpled near the foot of the bed, one boot overturned beneath the carved chair, my old silver ring glinting dully beside the leg of the nightstand. I stared at that ring for several heartbeats. It was the only thing I had kept from the day my wife died 3 years ago. Beyond the tall window, Asterhold was only beginning to stir under a pale green dawn. The city looked quiet from this height, almost peaceful, but I knew better. Peace had never belonged to me. A soft sound drew my gaze across the room. Lady Vespera Valmir stood at the window with her back to me. She wore nothing but a loose black silk robe that had slipped from one shoulder, revealing the strong, smooth line of her olive-green skin. Her black hair, threaded with strands of deep copper, was tied loosely at the nape of her neck, allowing a few strands to fall against the curve of her back. She was tall, taller than most women I had ever met, and every inch of her carried a quiet, controlled power that made the air feel heavier simply by her presence. She lifted a glass of water to her lips and drank slowly without turning. The early light traced the outline of her shoulders, the faint scars that crossed her upper back like pale rivers on dark earth. I knew that back. I had run my hands along it only hours earlier. My stomach tightened into a cold knot. I recognized her now, not just from the night before in the dimly lit tavern, but from a life I thought I had left behind. The same woman who had stood beside Lord Alric Valmir in every formal portrait. The orc widow who had become the sole ruler of the Valmir household after his death. Lady Vespera Valmir. Stepmother to Celine Valmir, the woman I had once loved with everything a broken widowed man still had left to give. The realization settled over me like cold water poured down my spine. I did not speak. I simply sat there, blanket clutched in one fist, watching the slow rise and fall of her breathing. She must have felt my gaze because she finally turned. Golden eyes, dark and steady as aged honey, met mine across the quiet room. There was no surprise in them, no shame, only a calm, almost gentle awareness, as though she had been waiting for this exact moment when memory finally caught up with me. "You're awake," she said. Her voice was low, slightly rough from sleep, yet perfectly controlled. "There is water on the table. If your head still aches, drink it slowly." I did not reach for the glass. My eyes drifted once more to the large portrait hanging on the far wall, Lord Alric with his hand resting on the shoulder of a young blonde girl, and standing just behind them in formal black and gold was the same woman now watching me from across the bedroom. Everything inside me went still. Vespera's mouth curved in the faintest of movements, not quite a smile, but close enough to acknowledge the weight of what we both now understood. "You remember," she said softly. I swallowed. My throat felt raw. "Lady Vespera Valmir." She inclined her head once as if confirming a simple fact. "Yes." I reached for my shirt on the floor, pulling it on with deliberate, unhurried movements, even though my hands wanted to shake. I missed the first button twice before I managed to fasten it. The fabric still carried the faint scent of the tavern and of her. Last night returned in slow, vivid fragments, the Ember Court high above the harbor lights, my friend dragging me there to celebrate a new position I desperately needed, the veiled woman sitting alone at the shadowed end of the bar. The way she had looked at me as though she could see every quiet exhaustion I had carried for 3 years. The way her fingers had brushed the rim of my glass, and she had said without any demand in her voice, "Tonight you do not have to carry everything alone." I had never asked her name that night. She had never asked mine. We had spoken of small, painful truths until the words ran out, and then we had simply let the silence become something else. Now in the cold light of dawn, I understood exactly who she was. I finished buttoning my shirt and stood. The stone floor was cool beneath my bare feet. "I should leave." "You should," she agreed, setting the glass down with a soft click. "You have your first morning at the manor." The words landed like a second blow. I paused, one boot in my hand. The position. Keeper of the inner household ledgers. Yes, she knew. She had known from the moment our eyes first met in that tavern. I let out a slow breath that did not quite become a laugh. "You knew who I was the entire time." "I did. From the first moment you saw me." "Yes. And still you brought me here." Vespera took one unhurried step closer to the bed. The silk of her robe shifted with the movement, revealing the faint imprint of my teeth on the curve of her shoulder. My chest tightened at the sight. If I told you I simply wanted one night where someone looked at me as a woman instead of a title or a widow or a ruler, she said quietly, would you believe me? I met her eyes. The truth sat heavy between us. I don't know what I believe right now. Then at least we share that much. I finished pulling on my second boot. My fingers worked slowly, deliberately giving my mind time to catch up. I came to Asterhold for my daughter. If this position disappears because of last night, Lila and I will have nothing left. Vespera studied me for a long moment, the golden light of dawn tracing the strong line of her jaw. Then she reached for a folded card on the side table and held it out to me. My official pass into Valmere Manor. The seal was still warm. The position remains yours, she said. Last night does not change that. I took the card but did not look away from her face. What am I supposed to call you when I stand before you inside the manor? Within these walls you will call me my lady. Her voice was steady, almost gentle. As for last night, if you wish to name it a mistake, I will not stop you. I held her gaze. The room was quiet except for the distant sound of the city waking far below. I knew I should call it a mistake. I should walk out of this tower, forget the warmth of her skin, forget the way her voice had softened against my ear, forget how for a few hours I had not felt like a man drowning under the weight of grief and poverty. But the words would not come, because the truth was far more dangerous than any title or scandal. Last night had reminded me that I was still alive, and I was not sure I was ready to name that feeling a mistake. I left the eastern tower as the sky continued to lighten. The streets of Asterhold were beginning to stir, the low rumble of carts over stone, the faint smell of fresh bread drifting from the bakeries near the lower gate, the first calls of merchants setting up their stalls. I walked slowly, each step measured, letting the cold morning air press against my face. I had less than 2 hours before I had to return to the very place where everything had changed. When I reached the small rented room by the docks, Lila opened the door before I could knock. My 6-year-old daughter stood there in her worn nightgown, hair a wild tangle of dark curls, clutching the one-eyed stuffed fox I had sewn for her after her mother passed. She looked up at me with those serious gray eyes and tilted her head. Papa, she said very solemnly, you look like someone who stayed out too long thinking about things you shouldn't. I crouched down slowly so we were eye to eye. A small, tired smile tugged at my mouth. Yeah, I whispered, brushing a curl from her cheek. I think you're right, little one. She studied my face for another quiet moment, then wrapped her small arms around my neck without asking any more questions. And for the first time that morning, the weight in my chest felt just a fraction lighter. The walk back to our small rented room felt longer than it should have. Asterhold was waking properly now, the streets filling with the low rumble of carts, the sharp calls of fishmongers, and the warm scent of fresh bread drifting from the bakeries along the lower docks. I kept my coat buttoned high even though the morning was not cold. Every step reminded me of the faint ache in my shoulders and the way my skin still carried the scent of dark wine and warm leather. When I reached the narrow door of our room, Lila was already waiting. She stood on tiptoe, one small hand gripping the edge of the wooden frame, the other clutching her one-eyed stuffed fox. Her dark curls were still messy from sleep, and her gray eyes studied me with that quiet seriousness only a 6-year-old could manage. Papa, she said softly, you were gone a long time. I crouched down so we were eye to eye and brushed a stray curl from her cheek. I know, little one. I'm sorry. She tilted her head, looking at me the way she always did when she was trying to read something too big for words. Did something bad happen? I hesitated. The truth sat heavy behind my teeth, but I could not tell her. Not yet. Maybe not ever. No, I said instead, and the lie tasted like ash. Just a long night. But I'm here now. Lila nodded once, accepting my answer the way children sometimes do when they know there is more but choose to trust anyway. She stepped forward and wrapped her thin arms around my neck. I held her close, breathing in the familiar scent of cheap soap and the faint lavender I had rubbed into her pillow the night before. For a moment, the weight of the morning lifted. I made you tea, she whispered against my shoulder. It's probably cold now. I smiled into her hair. Cold tea is still tea. We went inside together. The single room was small and dim, but it was ours. I sat at the rickety table while Lila carefully poured the cooled tea into my chipped cup. She climbed onto the bench beside me, swinging her bare feet, and watched me drink. You look different, she said after a while. Different how? She thought for a long moment, chewing her lower lip. Like you saw something big and you're still thinking about it. I set the cup down slowly. Maybe I did. Lila reached over and patted my hand with her small, warm fingers. It's okay, Papa. Big things take time to think about. I looked at her, then really looked, and felt something tight in my chest loosen just a fraction. She was only 6, but sometimes she spoke like she had already lived twice as long. We finished breakfast in comfortable silence. I helped her wash her face, brushed her hair into 2 neat braids, and made sure her coat was buttoned properly before we stepped back out into the street. She held my hand the entire way to the small schoolroom near the market square where the dock workers sent their children. Before she went inside, she turned and hugged me again. "Papa," she whispered, "whatever the big thing is, I hope it makes you smile later." I kissed the top of her head and watched her disappear through the door. Only when she was safely inside did I turn and begin the long walk back toward Valmere Manor. The manor looked different in full daylight. Tall stone walls rose against the morning sky, the black and silver banners of House Valmere fluttering in the light breeze. The gates were already open, but the guards at the entrance gave me a long measuring look before waving me through. I kept my steps even, my face calm, even though my heart was beating too hard against my ribs. Maris Thorne, the silver-haired steward, met me just inside the main courtyard. "Keeper Voss," she said, her voice crisp and businesslike. "You are expected in the inner study. Lady Vespera will see you shortly." I followed her through the wide corridors. The manor smelled of polished wood, beeswax, and faint herbs. Servants moved quietly along the edges of the halls, eyes lowered. No one spoke to me. I was the new face, the unknown quantity, and they were waiting to see what I would become. Maris stopped outside a heavy oak door. "Remember what I told you yesterday," she said without looking at me. "You work for Lady Vespera alone. Everything else is noise." She opened the door and stepped aside. I walked in. Lady Vespera Valmer sat behind a long dark desk near the tall windows. Sunlight poured across the room, catching on the silver threads in her black gown and the copper strands woven through her hair. She was reading a letter, one long green finger tracing the edge of the parchment. When I entered, she did not look up immediately. She finished the page, set it aside, then lifted her golden eyes to mine. "Elias Voss," she said. Her voice was the same low, steady tone I remembered from the night before, but now it carried the weight of authority. "You may sit." I sat in the chair opposite her desk. The silence stretched between us, thick and deliberate. I could hear the distant sounds of the manor servants moving in the hallway, the soft clink of silverware being polished somewhere below the faint cry of gulls over the harbor. Inside the study, there was only the sound of our breathing and the scratch of her quill as she signed the letter she had just read. Finally, she set the quill down and looked at me fully. "Last night does not exist in this room," she said quietly. "Do you understand?" "I understand, my lady." Her eyes held mine for a long moment, searching. I did not look away. Whatever she saw in my face seemed to satisfy her because she gave a small nod. "Good. Then we begin." She slid a thick ledger across the desk. The cover was worn leather, the pages inside filled with neat columns of numbers and coded entries. For the next hour, she explained the work in calm, measured detail, the household accounts, the incoming shipments from the northern mines, the coded letters from the border outposts, the private expenses that no one outside this room was ever meant to see. Her voice never wavered. She spoke as though we were two strangers who had never shared a bed or a single honest word in the dark. I listened. I took notes. I asked careful questions when I needed to. And all the while, I was aware of how close her hand was to mine when she pointed to a line on the page, how the faint scent of dark wine and warm leather still clung to her skin beneath the formal perfume she wore, how her golden eyes flicked to my face for the briefest second whenever she thought I was not looking. The morning passed slowly, deliberately. At one point, she stood and walked to the tall window looking down at the courtyard below. I remained seated, watching the line of her shoulders beneath the black silk. She did not turn when she spoke again. "Celine will be in the manor today," she said. "She has returned from the southern estates." I felt the name like a small blade pressed against my ribs. Celine Valmere, the woman who had once promised me a future and then left without a backward glance when her father died and the weight of the house became too heavy for her to carry a poor widowed clerk and his daughter. Vespera turned slightly, just enough to see my face. "You will be polite," she said. "You will be professional, and you will not speak of last night. Not to her, not to anyone." I nodded once. "Yes, my lady." She studied me for another long moment, then returned to her desk. The rest of the morning passed in the same careful rhythm. We reviewed ledgers. We checked incoming manifests. We spoke only of numbers and dates and shipments. Every word was measured. Every glance was controlled. But when the door to the study opened without a knock and Celine Valmere stepped inside, the careful rhythm shattered. She wore a silver-blue gown that caught the light like water. Her blonde hair was pinned neatly, but her face was pale and her eyes, the same gray as Lila's, widened the moment they landed on me. "Mother," she said, voice tight. "I was told the new keeper had arrived." Vespera did not look surprised. "He has. Elias Voss will be handling the inner household accounts from now on." Celine's gaze flicked back to me. For a heartbeat, the mask of composure slipped, and I saw everything she felt: shock, anger, hurt, and something sharper that looked dangerously like jealousy. "You," she said quietly. The word was not a greeting. I stood slowly bowing my head with perfect formality. My lady Celine. She stared at me for several long seconds. The air in the room grew thick heavy with everything we were not allowed to say. Vespera's voice cut through the silence, calm and final. You may leave us, Celine. We still have work to finish. Celine's hands tightened at her sides. She looked at her stepmother, then back at me, and for one brief moment, I saw the girl I had once loved, the girl who had laughed in my arms and promised me the world before the world took her away. She turned without another word and left the room, closing the door behind her with a soft, deliberate click. Vespera waited until the footsteps faded down the corridor. Then she looked at me. Are you all right? She asked so quietly I almost did not hear it. I sat back down. My hands were steady on the ledger, but my pulse was not. I will be, I said. She watched me for another long moment, golden eyes, unreadable. Then she slid the next ledger across the desk, and we continued working as though nothing had happened. But something had, and we both knew the morning was only the beginning. The days that followed settled into a rhythm I had not expected. Each morning I rose before the first light reached the lower docks, washed quickly in the cold basin of our rented room, and helped Lila dress for the small school near the market square. She never asked why my eyes looked tired or why I sometimes stared at the wall for too long while tying her braids. She simply handed me her one-eyed fox and said, "He wants to go with you today too," as if the stuffed toy could protect me from whatever weight I carried back from the manor. I walked her to school, kissed the top of her head, and watched her disappear through the narrow door with the other children. Only then did I turn toward Valmere Manor, the pass card heavy in my coat pocket like a secret I could not set down. Inside the manor, the corridors were always quiet in the early hours. Servants moved like shadows, voices kept low. I learned to walk the same way, shoulders straight, steps, measured face calm, even when my pulse refused to slow. Maris Thorne greeted me each day with the same crisp nod and the same warning spoken without words. Everything you see here stays behind these walls. The work itself was not difficult. The ledgers were precise, the codes familiar from my old life as a clerk. I spent long hours at the wide desk in the inner study, copying entries, checking manifests, noting the quiet discrepancies that no one else seemed to notice. Vespera sat across from me most mornings. She spoke only of numbers and shipments and sealed letters from the northern outposts. Her voice never wavered, her golden eyes never lingered. But sometimes when the room was empty of servants and the door was closed, she would set her quill down and look at me for one long, silent moment. In those moments, I felt the night in the tower press against my skin again, the warmth of her breath, the weight of her hand on my back, the way she had whispered my name like it was something fragile. Neither of us spoke of it, not in daylight, not inside the manor. The first time Celine appeared again was on the fourth morning. I was alone in the study checking a column of figures for the salt shipment from the southern marshes when the door opened without a knock. She stepped inside wearing a simple gray gown, hair pinned back tightly. Her eyes found me immediately. "You are still here," she said. The words were quiet, but they carried the same edge I remembered from 3 years ago, the tone of someone who had once held power over me and had never forgotten it. I stood slowly bowing my head with careful formality. My lady Celine. She closed the door behind her and walked to the window, looking out at the courtyard instead of at me. "I thought you would have left by now." "Most men do when they realize what this house really is." "I need the position," I answered simply. She turned then. Her gray eyes, the same shade as Lila's, studied my face the way she used to when we were younger and the world still felt small enough to share. "You have a daughter," she said. It was not a question. I saw her name in the household records. Lila, 6 years old. I felt something cold settle in my stomach. "Yes." Celine's mouth tightened. "And yet you still came back here." "To work for her." I did not answer. There was nothing safe to say. She stepped closer, voice dropping until it was almost a whisper. "You have no idea what you've walked into, Elias. She doesn't keep people close because she cares. She keeps them close because they are useful." The door opened again before I could reply. Vespera entered carrying a sealed letter. She took in the scene with one slow glance, Celine standing too near my desk, my hands resting on the ledger, the tension thick enough to taste. "Celine," she said, voice perfectly even, "you are interrupting the morning accounts." Celine straightened the mask of composure, sliding back into place. "I was merely greeting the new keeper, mother." Vespera's golden eyes flicked to me for half a second, then returned to her stepdaughter. "Then the greeting is finished. You may leave." Celine hesitated only a moment before she turned and walked out, closing the door with a soft click that somehow sounded louder than it should have. Vespera crossed to her desk and sat down as though nothing had happened. She broke the seal on the letter and began reading. I returned to my column of figures. The silence stretched between us again, but this time it felt different, heavier, more aware. After several minutes, she spoke without looking up. "You do not have to answer her questions. I know." She set the letter aside and finally met my eyes. If she makes you uncomfortable, tell me. I considered the offer. The words felt dangerous, like stepping onto ice that might crack at any moment. I can handle Celine, I said quietly. Vespera studied me for a long time. Then she gave a single nod and returned to her work. The rest of the morning passed in the same careful rhythm. We spoke only of the ledgers. We checked the coded entries from the border outposts. We made no mention of the night in the tower or the conversation that had just taken place. But when the midday bell rang and the servants brought a light meal to the study, Vespera did something unexpected. She dismissed the servants and closed the door herself. Then she set a second plate across from mine. Eat, she said. You have been working since before dawn. I looked at the simple meal bread, cheese, cold sliced meat, and a small bowl of stewed fruit. It was far better than anything Lila and I could afford at the docks. I sat. We ate in silence for a while. The only sounds were the soft clink of silverware and the distant murmur of the manor going about its day. I was aware of every small movement she made, the way her long fingers broke the bread, the way her robe sleeve brushed the edge of the desk, the way her golden eyes occasionally lifted to watch me. After several minutes, she spoke again, voice low. Lila is 6. Yes, she has your eyes. I set my spoon down slowly. She has her mother's smile. Vespera nodded once as though filing the information away carefully. Does she know where you work? She knows I have a new position. She does not know the details. Good. She took another small bite, then added almost gently, Children should not carry the weight of this house. The words settled between us like something warm and unexpected. I looked at her across the desk. Why are you doing this? She met my gaze without hesitation. Doing what feeding me, asking about my daughter, pretending the night in the tower never happened while making sure I eat. Vespera set her knife down. The room grew very quiet. Because I am tired of pretending, she said simply, and because I have spent too many years sitting at tables where no one asked about the people waiting for me at home. She did not reach for my hand. She did not soften her voice into anything seductive. She simply told the truth the way she had that first night in the tavern. I felt something shift inside my chest, small, careful, but undeniably real. We finished the meal in silence. When the plates were cleared and the servants had come and gone again, Vespera stood and walked to the tall window. She looked out over the harbor for a long moment before she spoke. Tonight, she said, after the manor quiets, come to the small balcony above the eastern tower. There will be no servants, no ledgers, just two people who do not have to pretend for a while. I stood as well. Is that an order, my lady? She turned to face me. The afternoon light caught the copper threads in her hair and made her eyes look almost amber. No, she answered. It is an invitation. You are free to refuse. I held her gaze for several heartbeats. Then I gave the smallest nod. That evening, after I had walked Lila back to our room, helped her with her letters, and tucked her into bed with her one-eyed fox, I returned to the manor through the side gate. The corridors were quieter now. Most of the lamps had been turned low. I moved through the shadows I had learned in the past few days until I reached the narrow staircase that led to the small private balcony above the eastern tower. Vespera was already there. She wore a simple dark robe, hair loose down her back, and she stood at the stone railing looking out at the lights of Asterhold below. When she heard my footsteps, she did not turn immediately. She simply waited until I stepped up beside her. The night air was cool and carried the faint salt of the harbor. For a long time, neither of us spoke. We simply stood side by side, two people who had shared a bed and were now trying to understand what that meant in the daylight. Finally, she spoke, voice barely above the wind. I do not expect anything from you, Elias. I looked at her profile, the strong line of her jaw, the way the breeze moved a strand of copper-threaded hair across her cheek. I know, I said. She turned then. Her golden eyes caught the faint lantern light from below. But I would like to know you, she added. Not the keeper of the ledgers, not the man who once loved my stepdaughter. Just you. I felt the weight of those words settle over me like a blanket I had not realized I needed. So I told her. I told her about the small room by the docks, about Lila's serious gray eyes and the way she still asked about her mother in her sleep, about the 3 years of scraping by after my wife died, about the fear that never quite left me that one day I would not be enough for my daughter. I spoke quietly without drama, letting the words fall between us like stones into still water. Vespera listened without interrupting. She did not offer empty comfort. She simply stood there, shoulder almost brushing mine, and let me speak until there was nothing left to say. When I finished, she remained silent for a long time. Then she reached out and rested her hand lightly on the stone railing beside mine. Not touching, just close enough that I could feel the warmth. Thank you, she said. I looked at her, then really looked, and saw the woman behind the title for the first time since that first night. Not Lady Vespera Valmare, not the orc widow who ruled a powerful house. Just Vespera. A woman who had carried her own weight for too long and was tired of doing it alone. I did not kiss her that night. We simply stood together on the small balcony, two people sharing the same quiet air while the city lights flickered far below and the weight of everything we were not allowed to say pressed gently against our shoulders. And for the first time since I had woken up naked in her bed, I did not feel like I had made a mistake. I felt like I had taken the first careful step towards something I had not known I was allowed to want. The weeks that followed moved like slow water over stone quiet on the surface, but carving deeper channels underneath. Each morning I still rose in the dark, lit the small lamp in our rented room, and helped Lila wash her face with the cold water from the basin. She would stand on the wooden stool, eyes half closed, while I combed her dark curls into two neat braids. Sometimes she would lean her forehead against my chest and murmur, "Papa, your heart is loud again today." I never knew how to answer that. I would only kiss the top of her head and tell her the bread was warming by the fire. We walked to school hand in hand, her small fingers curled trustingly around mine. She talked about the letters she was learning, the way the harbor gulls fought over crumbs the color of the sky when the sun first touched the water. She never asked about the manor or why I sometimes returned with the scent of polished wood and expensive ink still clinging to my coat. She simply accepted the changes the way children do when they believe their father will keep the world steady. At the manor, the days took on their own careful rhythm. I arrived before most of the servants, passed through the side gate with my pass card, and made my way to the inner study. Vespera was usually already there, seated at the long desk, with the first light of morning falling across her shoulders. She wore dark gowns, edged in silver, her black hair pinned back with simple bone combs, and every movement she made was measured and precise. We spoke only of ledgers, shipments, coded letters from the northern outposts, and the quiet discrepancies I began to notice in the salt trade. She never touched me inside those walls. She never looked at me longer than necessary. Yet every time she leaned over the desk to point at a column of figures, I felt the faint warmth of her skin near mine. Every time her low voice explained a sealed manifest, I remembered the way that same voice had whispered my name in the dark of the tower. The restraint was deliberate. It was also becoming unbearable. One afternoon, after a long morning of checking incoming manifests from the southern marshes, Vespera dismissed the servants and closed the heavy oak door herself. She walked to the tall window and looked out at the harbor for a long moment before she spoke. "Lila asked me about the gulls yesterday," she said quietly. I set my quill down slowly. "When did you see Lila yesterday afternoon?" I was passing the school square on my way back from the lower warehouses. She was standing at the gate with the other children watching the birds fight over scraps. Vespera turned slightly, her golden eyes catching the light. She recognized me. She waved. My chest tightened. "What did you do?" I waved back. A faint curve touched the corner of her mouth, not quite a smile, but close enough to soften the hard line of her jaw. She told me the gulls were greedy but brave. Then she asked if I liked bread with honey. I could picture it so clearly, Lila's serious gray eyes, her small hand waving without hesitation, the way she always offered pieces of herself to people she decided were safe. Vespera continued, voice low. I told her I did. She said next time she would bring me a piece if her father allowed it. I felt something warm and terrifying bloom in my chest. You should not encourage her. I know. She looked at me then fully, but I did not have the heart to tell a child no when she offered kindness so freely. We stood in silence for several heartbeats. Outside, the distant sound of carts rolling over stone drifted up from the courtyard. Inside the study, the air felt thick with everything we were not saying. Finally, I spoke. She has not had many people offer her kindness since her mother died. Vespera nodded once as though she had already guessed that truth. Children remember the ones who are gentle with them. That evening, after I had walked Lila home, helped her with her letters, and tucked her into bed with her one-eyed fox, I returned to the manor through the side gate once more. The corridors were quieter than usual. Most lamps had been turned low. I moved through the shadows until I reached the narrow staircase leading to the small private balcony above the eastern tower. Vespera was waiting. She stood at the stone railing wearing a simple dark robe, her hair loose down her back. The night air carried the faint salt of the harbor and the distant murmur of waves against the docks. When I stepped up beside her, she did not turn immediately. She simply waited until my shoulder brushed lightly against hers. For a long time, we stood together without speaking. The city lights flickered far below like scattered embers. I could feel the warmth of her arm near mine, the slow rise and fall of her breathing. Then she spoke, voice barely louder than the wind. "Celine came to see me this afternoon. I kept my eyes on the harbor. What did she want?" "She asked why I had chosen you." Vespera's fingers rested lightly on the stone railing. "She reminded me that you were once hers, that you had a child, that bringing you into this house was a risk. I felt the old wound stir, but it no longer burned the way it once had. And what did you tell her?" I told her the truth. She turned to face me then. The lantern light from below caught the copper threads in her hair and made her golden eyes look almost amber. I told her you were the first person in years who looked at me and saw something other than a title or a threat. Her hand lifted slowly and rested against my chest, right over my heart. The touch was light, almost hesitant, nothing like the urgent heat of our first night. It was something quieter, something that asked permission. I covered her hand with mine. We stood like that for a long time, the night air cool against our skin, the city breathing softly below us. No words were needed. The silence between us had become its own kind of language. Later, when the manor had grown completely still, she walked me to the door of the small chamber I used when I stayed late. At the threshold, she paused. "Tomorrow," she said softly, "bring Lila here after school, just for a short visit. The kitchen staff will have honey bread waiting." I searched her face. "Are you sure?" "I am sure I want to see the child who offered me kindness without knowing who I am." I nodded. She did not kiss me that night. She simply rested her forehead against mine for one brief moment, then stepped back into the shadows of the corridor. The next afternoon, I brought Lila to the manor. She walked beside me through the tall gates, eyes wide at the stone walls and silver banners. When we reached the small private garden behind the eastern tower, Vespera was already waiting on a stone bench beneath the flowering vines. She wore a simple dark gown, no jewelry except the small bone comb in her hair. Lila stopped a few steps away and looked up at her with that same serious expression she used when meeting something new. "You're very tall," she said. Vespera's mouth curved in a gentle line. "I have been told that before." Lila tilted her head. "Do you like honey bread?" "I do." "Then I brought you some." Lila reached into the small cloth bag I had given her and pulled out a slightly squashed piece of bread wrapped in paper. "Papa said you might be hungry after counting numbers all day." Vespera accepted the bread with both hands as though it were something precious. "Thank you, Lila. That is very kind." They sat together on the bench while I stood a few steps away watching. Lila chattered about school, about the gulls, about the color of the sea when the sun set. Vespera listened with quiet attention, asking gentle questions, never talking down to her. At one point, Lila reached out and touched the edge of Vespera's sleeve, tracing the silver thread with one small finger. "It's pretty," she said. Vespera looked down at the child's hand on her arm. Something soft and unguarded crossed her face, an expression I had never seen on her before. Later, when we were leaving, Lila hugged Vespera's waist without hesitation. Vespera froze for half a second, then rested one large green hand gently on the back of Lila's head. That night, after I had tucked Lila into bed and returned to the manor, Vespera met me on the balcony again. She did not speak at first. She simply stepped close and rested her head against my shoulder. I wrapped my arms around her slowly, carefully, as though she might vanish if I held her too tightly. For the first time since the night I had woken in her bed, I did not feel like I was falling. I felt like I was standing on solid ground for the first time in years. But the ground beneath us was already beginning to crack. The next morning, a sealed letter was waiting on my desk in the study. It carried no sender's mark. Inside was a single line written in plain ink. "The child is not safe as long as you remain in that house." I burned the letter immediately, but the smell of smoke lingered on my fingers all day, and I knew the quiet weeks were ending. The real storm was only just beginning. The letter was the last warning. It arrived on my desk the following morning, slipped between two ordinary manifests as if it belonged there. No seal, no signature, only a single line written in plain black ink. "The child will not be safe as long as you remain." I read it twice, then folded it neatly and burned it in the small brazier beside the window. The smoke rose thin and bitter. I watched it curl toward the ceiling until it disappeared, but the words stayed behind my eyes like a brand. That afternoon, when I walked Lila home from school, I kept her hand tighter than usual. She did not complain. She simply looked up at me with those quiet gray eyes and said, "Papa, your fingers are cold." I smiled for her sake and told her it was only the wind. But the wind had nothing to do with it. 2 days later, the warning became real. We were leaving the small garden behind the eastern tower where Vespera had begun meeting Lila after school. The child had just finished showing Vespera how to fold a paper boat the way I had taught her. Vespera was listening with the same gentle attention she always gave my daughter, her large green hand resting lightly on the stone bench. The late afternoon light painted everything soft and golden. Then the arrow came. It whistled past my ear and buried itself in the wooden post beside Lila's head with a dull thud. The fletching was black. The shaft carried the faint scent of pitch. Lila screamed. I moved without thinking. I swept her into my arms, shielding her body with mine, and ran toward the nearest doorway. Vespera was already moving faster than I had ever seen her, one arm around both of us, the other drawing the short blade she always kept at her side. Servants shouted. Footsteps pounded across the courtyard. Someone was yelling for the guards. We reached the safety of the inner corridor. I pressed Lila against my chest, her small body shaking, her face buried in my coat. She did not cry out loud anymore. She only whimpered, the sound so small it broke something inside me. Vespera stood in front of us, back straight, blade still drawn. Her golden eyes were no longer gentle. They were the eyes of the warrior she had once been before she became a widow and a ruler. "Maris," she said, voice low and cold, "lock the manor. No one leaves. No one enters." The silver-haired steward nodded once and disappeared down the hall. Vespera turned to me. For the first time since I had known her, I saw fear in her face, not for herself, but for the child trembling in my arms. "Is she hurt?" she asked. I shook my head. My voice would not work. Vespera knelt slowly so she was eye level with Lila. She did not reach out. She simply waited until my daughter lifted her tear-streaked face. "Lila," Vespera said gently, "you are safe. I promise you that. No one will touch you while I am here." Lila stared at her for a long moment. Then she reached out one small hand and touched the edge of Vespera's sleeve the same way she had done in the garden. "You're still here," Lila whispered. Vespera's voice cracked just barely. "I'm still here." That night, Lila slept in the small chamber beside mine inside the manor. She refused to let go of my hand until she finally drifted off the one-eyed fox tucked under her chin. I sat on the edge of the bed long after her breathing had evened out, watching the rise and fall of her small chest. Vespera stood in the doorway, silent. When I finally looked up, she spoke. "I can send you both away," she said. "Tonight. There is a safe house in the southern hills. No one would find you." I stood slowly and crossed the room to her. "No," I said. Her golden eyes searched mine. "Elias, I am not running anymore." I took her hand and placed it against my chest so she could feel how hard my heart was beating. "Not from this house. Not from you. Not from the life we are trying to build here." She closed her eyes for a moment. When she opened them again, the fear was still there, but something else had joined it, a fierce, quiet resolve. "Then we fight together," she said. The next 3 days passed in a blur of guarded corridors and whispered plans. Vespera did not hide me or Lila. She brought us into the open, into the main halls, into the garden, even into the formal receiving room when visitors came. She stood beside us openly, her hand sometimes resting lightly on Lila's shoulder, sometimes brushing mine when no one else was looking. She was showing the entire manor and anyone watching from outside that we were not a weakness to be exploited. We were hers to protect. On the 4th night, Celine came to the study while Vespera and I were reviewing the final ledgers. She did not knock. She simply walked in and closed the door behind her. For a long moment, the three of us stood in silence. Then Celine looked at me, really looked, and her voice was quieter than I had ever heard it. "I sent the letter," she said. The words hung in the air like smoke. Vespera did not move. "Why?" "Because I was angry." Celine's hands trembled at her sides. "Because I saw you with him. With his child. And I remembered what I threw away. I thought if I frightened him enough, he would leave. I thought," her voice broke. "I thought I could still have him back." I stepped forward until I stood between them. "You almost got my daughter killed," I said. My voice was calm, but each word was edged with steel. "That is not love, Celine. That is not even regret. That is poison." Celine looked at me for a long time. Tears slipped down her cheeks, but she did not wipe them away. "I know," she whispered. "And I am sorry." She turned to Vespera then, and for the first time I saw something like respect pass between the two women who had shared the same house and the same name for so many years. "I will leave the manor tomorrow," Celine said. "I will not come back until you both decide I am no longer a threat." Vespera studied her stepdaughter for several heartbeats. Then she spoke, voice low but final. "Go with my blessing. But know this, if you ever raise a hand against this child again, I will not be merciful." Celine nodded once. She looked at me a final time, then turned and left the room. The door closed softly behind her. Vespera and I stood in the quiet that followed. She reached for my hand. I let her take it. That night, after Lila had fallen asleep in the chamber beside mine, Vespera came to me. We did not speak of Celine. We did not speak of the arrow, or the letter, or the fear that had gripped us for days. We simply lay together in the large bed in the eastern tower, the same bed where everything had begun. Her head rested on my chest. My fingers traced slow circles along the scars on her shoulder. "I love you," I said into the quiet dark. The words felt simple and enormous at the same time. Vespera lifted her head. Golden eyes met mine in the low lantern light. "I love you too," she answered. "And I love your daughter." She kissed me then, slow, deep, without urgency. When she pulled back, her forehead rested against mine. "Stay," she whispered. "Not because you need the position, not because you are afraid. Stay because this is where you belong." I closed my eyes and breathed her in, dark wine, warm leather, and the faint scent of the sea that always clung to her hair. "I'm staying," I said. The next morning, the three of us walked together through the main garden. Lila held my hand on one side and Vespera's on the other. She swung our arms gently as we walked, chattering about the paper boats she wanted to sail in the fountain. Vespera listened with the same quiet attention she always gave her. I walked between them, feeling the weight of the past weeks settle into something lighter, something that felt like home. Asterholt stretched out beyond the manor walls, full of noise and danger and possibility. We did not know what tomorrow would bring. We did not know how many more arrows or letters or old wounds would find their way to our door. But for the first time since I had woken up naked in Vespera's bed, I was not afraid of the future. I was walking toward it hand in hand with the orc woman who had once been a mistake, and the daughter who had taught us both how to be gentle again. And that I realized was the only ending I had ever truly wanted.